Good morning. Really nice to see Liz Bowles today, who's going to tell you all about things farm carbon related. But just before we do that, I'd like to tell you a little tiny bit about the background project, which has been funding us to do this and other things in the sort of carbon capture regenerative space. So about just over a year ago, we were given a fairly substantial amount of money, just under 6 million by DEFRA, to look at ways of on farm, seeing if we could mitigate the main impactors of climate change. I guess there's three main ones in forms of gas, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And we decided to concentrate primarily on carbon dioxide. So what can we do on farm to capture and hold as much carbon dioxide as possible? And there's all sorts of ways that we can do that. You can choose different crops that might pick up more. And once you've picked up that carbon dioxide, the key thing, of course, is what do you do with it? Crops can be used for a variety of things. They might be used for food or they might be used for non-food applications, but whatever the crop does, it's always doing something underground, and that relates to the root structure and the way that the roots interact with the soil microbial community. So a lot of carbon potentially can go into the soil, and not only do we want that to happen from a carbon capture point of view, but it also has a really profound and important effect on soil health and structure and the way that the crop can interact with that soil environment. And so just the fact of getting carbon into the soil is good on carbon capture and it's good on soil health. But there's all sorts of different ways you can do that. It depends on the crop, it depends on how you harvest it, and it depends on how deep it is and the way that that crop interacts with soil. So it's a huge subject and no possibility that Liz can cover all of it today, but she's going to have a jolly good go. In the project as a whole, we have 20 partners. We're looking at all things from cropping through soil health to what do you do with those crop products. So we're looking at value change and products. It's too many partners to mention every single one of them today, but it embraces academics, agronomists, farmers, and industry, and we're all working together. We've got another 2.5 years together. Please do come visit our site. We're the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping. We have a website called carboncapturecropping.com, and you can find out more about the project, and you can also sign up to our information, details about events such as this, and things like our news sheet. So I think that's absolutely enough from me, and let's get into the body of the day with Liz Bowles. Back to you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Lydia. Okay, Liz, if you want to share your screen, go for it.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Lydia, and hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here today to talk to you about really getting to grips with carbon. So I've got a few slides, and I'm hoping to leave plenty of time for questions after I've gone through the slide deck. I think that's where we'll probably get most value. So that's what I'm going to do first, is to share my screen and my slides. I think it's going to come up with full screen in just a minute, hopefully. There we go. Okay, so I've called it Getting to Grips with Carbon because I think all of us are kind of in this space of having, well, there's a lot to learn about it. And I think sometimes we think we understand something and then something else comes along and we realize we really don't. So there's some of these things. My apologies if I'm teaching grandma to suck eggs, but hopefully there'll be things in here that are new to you and also interesting. So firstly, Farm Carbon Toolkit, who are we? This photo was actually taken last week because we had our team away day near Bristol. And the organisation itself was set up back in 2009. We were set up by Farmers for Farmers, very much with the ambition of supporting farmers to really understand where their business greenhouse gas emissions were coming on from, how to reduce them, and also how to maximise carbon removals onto their farms. And we do that in two ways. We've got a team of farm soil and carbon advisors who are mostly in this picture, who really go down farm lanes all the time. They're working directly with farmers to help them to understand and take action. And secondly, we do this through our Farm Carbon Calculator, which was set up back in 2010, when it was probably one of the earliest calculators available in the UK. Our calculator is now one of the most popular in the UK, and just recently we agreed on collaborating with Agricole and Cool Farm Tool in order to accelerate methodology harmonisation where we can. And I'm very happy to talk about that a bit later if that's of interest to people. So that's who we are. So first of all, I wanted to, again, just really summarise some of the things that are now happening, and I think, and really emphasise their importance for agriculture. And actually, I don't think for any farmers in the audience, and indeed all of us, I don't think any of these things are surprising information for us. The sadness of it all is actually that it's happening so very quickly. I think a decade ago, perhaps we thought this kind of thing wouldn't be starting to happen till 2030. But what we're seeing now in terms of heat waves, heavy rain, droughts, is clearly causing more and more concern. And I don't think we're going to see that decreasing going forward. But obviously, these are the kind of things now that as farm businesses, if we're to continue to produce food, we have to work out how to mitigate the impacts of these increasingly violent weather features. So, and I think it's just worthwhile in terms of how we mitigate that to just pause for a moment, because many of the things for farm businesses that enable them to combat the impact of climate changes also enable them to adapt to climate change. And these are the kind of areas where adaptation is going to be necessary, and potentially some of the areas where some of those mitigations might come from. Certainly, we're already seeing impacts on crop development and growth and productivity and damage. We're already starting to think about growing different crops. I farm in the southwest of England, and increasingly there's more and more vineyards popping up around me because the climate is now suitable. And also changes and increases in occurrence of weeds, pests and diseases, certainly amongst livestock and increasingly probably amongst plants. And the final one on this list, which I think is hugely significant, and perhaps we still don't understand the full extent of it, is degradation of our resource space, especially soils. And that's really where this CHCX3 project comes in, is to help us to grow crops which can reverse soil degradation. So that I think is, and I think very often it's not clear until soil has gone past a tipping point in terms of degradation that we appreciate fully what's going on. So this slide, I often use it because we all talk about carbon emissions and we talk about reduction in carbon, but it's perhaps worth just noting that this is kind of a catch-all phrase, and within carbon accounting, we generally express all emissions as carbon dioxide equivalents. So we convert nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions to carbon dioxide equivalents. And we do that primarily to make it easier to compare emissions from different sources. But within agriculture, as you can see here, carbon dioxide really isn't the problem. The problem is coming from methane and nitrous oxide. Methane coming from manure management and from ruminants themselves, and nitrous oxide coming from generally fertilizers and secondarily manures. Carbon dioxide will be coming primarily from fossil fuel use and the embedded emissions that come from fossil fuel use in things like tractors and buildings. And I think it's really important to have this firmly in your mind, that managing carbon on farm, i.e. managing emissions, is very closely linked to business efficiency. And we'll see later that many of the things farmers can do will reduce reliance on emission-heavy inputs, and that will definitely reduce emissions. And I think the second thing to say is that there is no one answer for either farm businesses or indeed for the industry as a whole. But what I would say is that probably 10 years ago, we thought it was all too complicated. Now we're starting to find ways of making it easier to measure and understand. I'll give you one example of that. Just last year, we created an Italian version of our Farm Carbon Calculator that takes account of any differences in emissions inventory in Italy compared to England, and allows businesses bringing in produce from Italy to use the same calculator for their suppliers in the UK as for Italy. And I think increasingly we're becoming able to better account for those trans-border emissions. And I think the final point here, and really it came home to us at Farm Carbon Toolkit this year, that this dependence on weather is or can be significant. And for instance, we do a lot of soil testing, and we've been finding soils this year that have lost carbon despite the farmers doing all the right things. And the major reason for that will be the impact of adverse weather, whether that be winds, scouring, too much rain, too much drought. They are having an impact. But clearly, everybody in agriculture, we have to find a way of managing these whilst continuing to produce food. I thought I'd show you this because it's a kind of a typical partition of different types of emissions across both arable farms and ruminant livestock farms. So you can see for arable farms, that blue bit is all to do, I don't know if you can actually see it very well, fertilizer production and application. So it's really important that both the emissions from both fertilizer production and application are included in farmers' footprints. And the reason for that is if the farmer wasn't using the fertilizer, it wouldn't be being produced. And you can see that's the primary source of emissions on arable farms. Whilst for livestock farms, around 50% of all emissions are coming from methane fermentation itself, with the next big chunk coming from livestock manures. But there are things we can do to reduce those emissions, and we'll come and talk about those in just a minute. And now I want to just move on to tell you a little bit about what's going on within the carbon footprinting world, and also why it's important to manage carbon at a farm level. And increasingly at Farm Carbon Toolkit, we work with hundreds of farmers, and we're starting to see that more and more farmers are kind of starting to understand all these issues more and more, and are seeing that it does make business sense to understand their baseline and to then be able to think about what positive steps they can do to both reduce emissions and store more carbon in soils. And we're also seeing this ability to create a positive narrative around it, because it's the narrative of farmers actually taking action. It doesn't mean that they're going to solve, get to net zero or beyond overnight, but what it does demonstrate is that ability to make change happen. And you remember back along I was mentioning about adaptation to climate change. There's no doubt that for farm businesses, adapting to climate change creates greater resilience within their business. That's generally linked to making sure that the actual production systems are more resilient to shock, but also improving soil health to make sure your soils are more resilient to shock. Okay. And again, this may be teaching grandma to suck eggs, but I think what it's saying is that within calculating emissions from agriculture is really unique. It's actually the most difficult sector, I think bar none, to produce accurate carbon audits for, simply because there are so many variables. We're dealing with a biological system, which means that it changes. And it's really important to appreciate this. I think it's also worth mentioning that there's still a lot of areas where more research is needed in order for us to be able to more accurately forecast likely emissions from farms under different circumstances. And alongside that, there's also more work needed before we can properly introduce some of the novel fertilizers and some of the novel methane inhibitors that do reduce emissions from farm and from animals. But that's all coming. I would say that as a farm carbon calculator, we have a great long list of all the things that we know we need to do, and we're getting on with doing them as quickly as we can. Then moving on to carbon footprinting itself, I think I've probably said most of these things, but unless you've done that first step of identifying where those emissions are really coming from, it's hard to know where to go to make effective change. And I think for some businesses, there's been a reluctance to get going on this for all sorts of reasons, partly because of a concern that perhaps their customer will want to take some kind of ownership of any reductions. Secondly, a feeling perhaps that the results they might get will vary depending on the calculator that they use. And that is true. And the reason for that is that different calculators are seeking to ask and answer different questions. But through the methodology harmonization work that we're doing with AgriCalc and Cool Farm Tool, that will reduce over time. And again, to reiterate that all the calculators in the UK will identify the quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emitted from the farm, and then express it as a carbon dioxide equivalent to allow easier comparison. Within our calculator, we provide whole farm carbon footprints, which enable the estimation of sequestration as well as emissions, which I think is really valuable for evaluating what you can do next. So what I want to talk about next, and it's a slight kind of diversion from net zero, but increasingly at Farm Carbon Toolkit, we're starting to talk more in these terms, asking the question, what can farmers do to farm in a more climate positive way? And by that, I mean that if we are to effectively address climate change, we've also got to address a whole load of other different things, primarily around resource sustainability and prevention of pollution. So this next slide I'm going to share with you is really just a little bit of a ready reckoner for businesses looking to farm in a more positive climate fashion. And I'm saying the first one, that farm businesses need to offset their business emissions year in, year out. What I mean by that, and I think for many of us, we have this lovely view that once we get to net zero, the job is done and there's no need to make any further changes. However, for every subsequent year, the business will still have to sequester carbon equivalent to the business's emission to remain at net zero. And you can't use last year's sequestration that you offset against your emissions last year. You have to sequester more carbon every year. And potentially that can get more difficult, especially as soil remains for farm businesses that don't want to go into planting trees, the most effective way of storing carbon on farm. And perhaps if you remember nothing else, the number to remember is that for every 0.1% increase in soil organic matter, that's equivalent to storing 9 tons per hectare of carbon on your farm. And that's a significant amount. And I think the second thing, if you're going to work towards being a positive climate farm business, is the support of the reversal of biodiversity loss, soil health degradation, alongside improving water and air quality. And I think for me, increasingly, and I know there's a few of my ex-ADAS colleagues potentially on this call, I started my career focusing primarily on farm profitability. We've now got a whole load of other lenses that as a farm business, we have to consider. So, and they all have to work together. And obviously for some businesses, they'll prioritise different areas, but there almost needs to be some kind of way of measuring all of them as a joined index, a bit like an EBV, but for farm business performance. By that, I mean an estimated breeding value, which will be known to livestock farmers, but not necessarily to arable farmers. But it's about creating something of a similar kind of index for farm businesses that covers all these lenses. And you can see underneath, I've listed what I consider to be the 5 principles of positive climate farming. And first and foremost, improving soil health. That is the absolute foundation. It really is. It leads to all of the others below, but of itself, it will have the most profound impact on adaptation to climate change and mitigation of climate change. And the second one, you may think this is a bit woolly, providing for all the wildlife, which would like to call your farm their home. The reason I say that is really to make that point about the need to make sure our farms' ecosystems work well, because having that diverse wildlife on farm, whether it be in soil, in plants, in habitat, is not a nice to have. It's essential for effective functioning of the farm, the soils, etc. And I think increasingly, I see more and more farmers who are understanding that and taking action to do just this. Then the last 3 really are all about minimizing use of high emissions inputs. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I'm going to rattle through these because I think, again, these are the kind of practices or actions that farmers can take. And you can see some of the key actions are indeed the work that the CHC ×3 project is doing, encouraging bioenergy crops, encouraging low carbon farming practices, but that reducing food waste and consumption of energy intensive foods is also going to have to be part of that mix. And I took some time to thinking about some of these helpful farming practices, and I'm sure there's many others. I think I could have added to this list precision application of inputs, because again, that's going to have quite a significant impact in reducing reliance on these inputs, but I didn't put it in. But I think it's helpful, and certainly we find it helpful when we're talking to farmers and growers to have that sort of list to look at and pick from. I'm conscious that I don't want to overrun, so I want to give you loads of time to ask questions. So I've got a few more slides. And when I speak to farmers, they always ask me about, okay, so what's the impact going to be on farm profitability? Because at the very least, farmers don't really want to adapt farming practices that are going to reduce farm profitability. And so just recently, we did some work supported by Students for Sustainability to look at the financial impacts of these practices on farm businesses in England. And again, I must admit, I went back to my time as a farm business advisor with ADAS, and I put together the partial budgets for these practices to look at the financial impact. And I should say that where SFI payments were available for these practices, I've included them. Without the SFI payment, some of these practices some of them would be unprofitable. That would lead to reductions in profit. I've tried to include reasonable assumptions, and you can see the full assumptions in the report, which is on our website. But you can see that for a number of the practices, if they're highlighted in green, with SFI support, they can now have a positive impact on profit, as well as potentially supporting greater biodiversity and other benefits on farm. The orange ones potentially a neutral impact, and the purple ones potentially a negative impact. And I draw your attention specifically to the more complex and longer rotations. This was rotations including peas and beans. There's no doubt that such rotations are really beneficial for soil and for wildlife, but unfortunately at current legume prices, they are less profitable than growing key cereal crops such as wheat and rape. So the next thing we've done at Farm Carbon Toolkit, is we've looked at the impact, or rather we modelled the changes of emissions on adapting these practices. This is for arable farming. Sorry to be so many bar graphs, but I'll very quickly go through it. So what we did was we created a baseline, and that's the column on the left-hand side of the screen. We created a baseline for a 100-hectare farm growing milling wheat, feed wheat, and oilseed rape as the break crop. And we used published sources for likely use of inputs and cultivations, and derived this baseline emissions, which basically amounts to 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted per hectare. And you can see that the majority of that column is red, and that is fertilizers. I think that's really very helpful to see that sort of the significance of nitrogen fertilizer within arable farming rotations. And then what we did was we modeled a whole load of different more regenerative farming practices against that baseline to model the impact in terms of emissions reductions. And I've listed those all down the right-hand side. So baseline with reduced N fertilizer, baseline with extreme N fertilizer reduction, which was actually 65 kilograms of nitrogen reduction. Then we had a whole load of 4 options, which involved a 5-year rotation with 1 pulse crop, differing combinations with either nitrogen fixing cover crop or no cover crop, min-till or conventional till. And you can see that by and large, that 5-year rotation was able to reduce emissions by something like 25% compared to the baseline. Although it has to be said that reducing nitrogen fertilizers by around 65 kilograms per hectare across the whole rotation had a similar impact. And what I haven't put them in this graph because I've made the graph far too busy, but by comparison, simply moving to min-till or no-till on its own with no change to fertilizer does little to reduce emissions, simply because although it does reduce fossil fuel usage is dwarfed by the emissions coming from fertilizers. So really, I put that in just to provide that increasingly quantified information on the effect on emissions of adopting more regenerative farming practices. And I think I'm just going to show you this because it's something that came from a piece of work that I was involved with when I was at the Soil Association. And what it's doing is it's just showing you the likely impacts on ecosystem services of adopting a whole range of practices. And you can see for many of them, there's quite a lot of up and down arrows. They're shown in orange. The green ones are generally positive. And you can see in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, all the ones that involve either reducing inputs or increasing woody biomass are reducing inputs, mainly because they're sequestering carbon. I'm not sure if there's any there that I want to otherwise highlight, but I think the real point of this chart is that for many things, we don't know that the impact will always be positive or negative, and that's something I think increasingly we need to have more clarity on. And then one of the final things just to share with you is, in some ways it's as easy as this. Emissions are coming from fuels, from inputs, from crops, from livestock, from waste. If we can reduce those, and then we can build sequestration from trees, from hedges, from non-cropped areas and into soils, the overall carbon balance will improve. It sounds simple when you say it quickly. So look, I'm going to stop there and open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz.
That was brilliant. I don't know which of us is going to be chaired, Jasmine. Perhaps both of us can share it. if you'd like to put some questions to Liz, it's probably easiest if you put it in the chat, but if you have a particular wish to put perhaps a more complicated question, then I'm sure we could facilitate that, can we, Jasmine?
Yeah, of course.
I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but I have 2 or 3 questions that I want to start you off on, Liz.
Yeah.
I guess the first is a little bit of clarity. So you had a really nice slide which gave information about financial impact, and you were referencing some of the incentives that government has put in place.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I had a discussion with some about to be Welsh farmers. They're moving from England to Wales, and they reminded me that the incentives in Wales and England are a little bit different. So this is probably, maybe you don't know the differences, but certainly there are differences with some of the incentives, and some of them are not coming on stream at the same times. So if you've got any thoughts on that, that would be really useful.
Yes, I mean, certainly, I'm not on mute, am I? No. To answer the question, England is ahead of the other devolved nations in moving away from BPS and towards environmental land management schemes and support for specific practices. Other parts of the UK are moving in this direction, but more slowly. And I think the rationale for this, certainly in Scotland and Wales, was that they had more farms that were livestock based and would find it more difficult to actually adapt to the kind of ELMS type approach which is in place in England. And in fact, I mean, certainly that's the case, because many livestock farmers in England feel that the options available to them are much more limited than those available to arable farm businesses. But the change is coming in all those devolved nations, and it will be over a longer period of time. And certainly those devolved nations are, I think, looking at what's happening in England and learning from it. So in a way, we're a little bit like the guinea pigs, I think, in England, which is a bit of a shame, but that's where we are.
Thank you, Liz. So I've got one question that I think has come directly to me, and that was thoughts about what differences the weather makes. So clearly we're interested in the impact that these things has on weather, but putting it the other way round, what differences do weather changes make on the amount of, for example, nitrous oxide that's generated from the soil, be it under livestock or arable? Yeah, thoughts on that would be very useful.
Yeah. And certainly as temperatures rise, respiration in soil increases, which can lead to more losses. And I think that potentially was what was happening a little bit in our work in soils, where we were seeing soil organic matter lost despite the farmer doing the right thing. So I would say there's that going on. Keeping soil covered with a nice thick thatch for as much of the year as possible does mitigate that, because it keeps soil a little bit cooler than if it's exposed to all the elements. And I mean, it's a real conundrum, because keeping soil covered and probably having more density of vegetation, even more trees, but you've got to keep them there. And we're seeing higher incidence of wildfire, which, you know, the more tree cover we have, the more likely that is. And certainly the more understory there is, the more likely that is. But that is a sort of key principle, is keeping soil covered. The other thing you mentioned about other losses, temperature and water affect rate of greenhouse gas emissions as well. When it comes to manures, generally the wetter they are, the more methane that's going to be emitted and nitrous oxide. And in that regard, getting things covered, if you're going to apply manures, getting them covered by soil as quickly as possible is hugely important.
That leads brilliantly, Liz, to David's question, which is, what would you suggest are the top actions for upland beef and sheep farmers that they can take. I would guess methane would currently be their major carbon output. So it kind of follows on very nicely with what you were saying.
Thanks, David. It's nice to not exactly see you on the call, but know you're there. I mean, obviously, if you're an upland beef and sheep farmer, your biggest source of emissions will be methane, especially if you don't feed much concentrate feeds to your animals, and generally you don't. Then your access to any methane inhibitor is limited, simply because normally those are applied in feedstuffs, and if they're not getting any feed, they're not going to go anywhere to eat them. I think increasingly some of the innovations that are coming along will involve what kind of forage the animal eats. And I appreciate that if it's upland, you may or may not be doing much to influence the forage that's growing. And I think that's the bit that is the most limiting. If there's very little intervention going on in the first place, then your ability to make changes is much less. However, there is also work going on to look into the actual genetics of animals and breeding animals with lower levels of innate methane emissions. And Lydia, you'll remember at the Innovation Showcase the other day, some of this work was shown. I can't actually remember the extent of reduction in methane emissions from some of these animals that were being bred, but it wasn't insignificant. And to be honest, for an upland beef and sheep farm, that might be one of the best ways forward. If they are doing anything to amend forage composition, then bringing some of these different crops in that can either help pull carbon down deeper into the soil or can reduce emissions through either tannin content or other flavonoid content in the forage will be helpful. So I think that that would be the way to go if you're an upland beef and sheep farmer. Certainly at SCT, we aren't going around telling every livestock farmer they should reduce their numbers. Although having said that, reducing productivity will always help.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that I was having a conversation with another farmer this morning who's going over from sheep to goats. I think it's livestock which is a bit on the up and up in the UK. And there is some limited data to suggest that goats produce less methane intrinsically. We discussed this, and I suspect that the real underlying reason is perhaps to do with what they eat, which is they prefer herbs and trees, and that tends to impact the microbiome, doesn't it, and produces perhaps less methane.
Yeah,
Sorry.
You might do. I mean, certainly the rule of thumb for ruminants and methane production is the more fibrous the diet, the more methane they'll produce, because they have to digest that level of fiber. So that's why advice always used to be to feed animals on a very highly proteinaceous diet with low fiber, so they'll grow faster, therefore they'll produce less methane in their lifetime. But that doesn't really accord with the need to manage grazing habitat.
Indeed. I have a long question from Lucy. I might paraphrase it a little bit. So she talked about the table on likely impacts of ecosystem services being really helpful, and she's particularly interested in soil organic carbon. So where farmers are participating in voluntary schemes where they're rewarded, can you talk a little about improvements in soil organic carbon, how it's evidenced, and ways that farmers involved in such schemes can deal with years where the weather is bad and their soil organic carbon has increased?
Or organic carbon, has it increased or decreased?
So I'm puzzled by that, but I guess if we can talk around the sort of
Okay. And I guess the topic really here is how you validate and verify carbon stocks over time if you want to enter into any kind of voluntary carbon market. I think, could you sort of put your hand up if that's what you were asking about? Is it Lucy? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it was decreased. I can see it in the chat now. Yes. So this is quite a critical question, really, for many farmers. So the kind of best practice is that if you are thinking that you would like to enter into the voluntary carbon market and potentially be paid for increasing your soil carbon levels, then the first thing you have to do is to understand your baseline carbon stocks. That requires fairly intensive soil sampling, because if you think about it, what you're trying to do in that is to estimate literally how much carbon you have underneath your feet on your farm. That may go down to 20 centimeters, it might go down to a meter. And the deeper you can go, potentially the more carbon you have on your farm. So in order to estimate your starting carbon stocks, that's what you have to try and measure. That generally involves physical soil sampling down to as low as you can go, but probably at least 60 centimeters if you can. It also requires potentially quite a lot of soil samples, especially if your soil is pretty variable. Then once you've done all that, you will produce a fairly robust, well-evidenced baseline carbon stock for your farm. And then from that, you need to monitor what's changing over time. But I think I will probably also add to that in saying that at the moment, there is no agreed requirement. So it's down to the market and who's buying that carbon credit and what they require. Best practice guidance from the Sustainable Soils Alliance-led project a couple of years ago was that baseline should be measured and should be then measured again either in the middle or at the end of the scheme, so that you've got proper physical measurements rather than satellite type measurements, which are available, but which aren't really that granular. And then bearing in mind, if you're, and the reason that that's necessary is because potentially you need to be able to evidence the amount of carbon that you say you're going to increase your soil carbon stocks by. And I think there's a couple of other provisos as well within that voluntary carbon market, that whatever scheme you put in place involves changing practice. And strictly speaking, it should involve changing practice to something which you wouldn't do in the ordinary course of your farm business. In other words, it's something that you require additional funding to do. So that's one thing. So it should be additional, and also it should be permanent, at least for the life of the scheme, and ideally forever, because this is what we need to do, is to get those emissions out of the air and down into the soil. If you think of it a bit like the carbon capture scheme that was announced recently with Ed Miliband, spending blooming billions on paying the oil companies to capture the carbon out of the air and put it down the mine shafts where they've been digging up the oil from. They're going to have to invest billions to do what soil can do. And that's effectively what we're talking about soil doing. But we have to better get it down deep enough that it can't rapidly come back up through either cultivations or extreme weather events. So two important things really: whatever you do that's going to support soil carbon increases has to be additional to normal farming practice, and it has to be permanent, and it has to be possible to monitor. Sorry, that was long-winded, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the other end of the spectrum, so there's an interesting question here from Hannah. On high organic matter soils, such as fenland, are they open to these schemes? Because are you going to be paid for sequestering more carbon, given that you've already got quite a lot naturally? So yeah, thoughts on that, Liz?
Right, so I've got a funny feeling that Hannah probably knows more about this than I do, but I'll have a go. So, I mean, obviously they're high organic matter soils, but they are also subject to high levels of emissions. And certainly simply reducing those emissions on the kind of, through the ways we currently manage those soils, we're having a lot of emissions. So, and in fact, I think I'm right in saying, oh dear, now I'm going to get this wrong, but I think the emissions from lowland peat soils are, I'm going to say 12% of the total emissions from UK agriculture. It's significant. So, and if we were to address that loss, it would also have a significant, it would contribute a significant reduction in the overall emissions from agriculture. In terms of fenland soils being open to carbon schemes, I guess all the rules that I've just said would apply. There's no reason why they wouldn't. I don't think there is anyway, but perhaps I would want to do a bit of digging on that. However, I think that the challenge would be you don't want to plant trees on peatland soils. That's really not considered to be a good idea. And I think the first thing to do is to arrest the rate of carbon loss, organic matter loss from fenland soils, quite frankly. So I don't know if that helps, Hannah.
No, absolutely, I agree with you. It's funny, isn't it, Liz? We were discussing this the other day, and you were saying that one of your farmers that you've worked with has done so well in capturing carbon into his soil that he's got the same amount in the middle of his field now, which is there by the edge of the field underneath the hedge. And you know, great, hats off to that farmer. But yes, that it's important to keep going, but at some point you do reach a maximum. But on fenland soil, there's such a lot of potential for loss of that as it breaks down if it's not looked after carefully, that yes, retaining what you already have is really important. Right, there's a quick question here, which you can answer fairly quickly, I dare say. John Elliott asks, on your slide reflecting the benefit of reducing nitrogen inputs by 65 kilos, what did this do to the farm profitability?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so on that one, we were doing this for another organisation that was looking to find ways of supporting farmers to make practice change. They were responsible for working out the financial impact of that farm practice change. But from memory, for that 65 kilograms of fertilizer reduction, we did use the AHDB calculator, which kind of gives an indication of likely yield reduction on reducing fertilizer usage. I'm hoping they are both a reputable source of that information and also reliable. I think they probably are. And from memory, oh golly, there was a reduction in yield. I'm struggling right now to remember precisely what that was, and I don't think I'm going to better find that slide that quickly where that's in there. That's where we went to find that yield reduction, John. And it was significant, but not massive. I was quite surprised at how low it was actually, because I think it could have more of an impact than the AHDB calculator seemed to suggest. But even then, for some farm businesses, it would all be to do with the interrelationship between yield and fertilizer price and crop price, whether it made financial sense to make that reduction in inputs. And it did have an impact on profitability at the prices we included for fertilizer and crop. And that was the whole point, really, to work out what level of incentive would be required to de-risk that approach, de-risk that solution.
Absolutely. Now, there is a completely different, well, not completely, a fairly different question here. See what you make of it. So I'm going to read it out as it is. Can you give us an idea of net effect of using composted food, byproducts, waste, to feed the soils instead of bagged fertilizer? So that's a very specific question, but I think broadly it is a very interesting one, isn't it? To use not just bagged fertilizer, but all sorts of other composted material, and particularly waste material that might even be landfilled and a potent source of methane gas. So yeah, thoughts on that, Liz?
Yeah. I mean, it is complicated because it will depend what it is. But certainly, I always liken sort of artificial nitrogen fertilizers a bit to white sugar. They're a bit like an empty calorie for the soil, whereas those kind of composted products will have a whole range of nutrients and also a microbiome, which will give a whole load of benefits when applied to soil. Yes, there will be emissions of nitrous oxide and methane associated with them. And to some degree, that will depend on when you apply them, how wet it is, how hot it is, etc. But then all these things there's always a compromise, because if it was a waste anyway, it's almost like you have to start from what's the worst case scenario. And I guess the worst case scenario would be chucking it into landfill. Then you've got a question between whether putting it into an AD plant and producing electric and then using the digestate is a better bet than composting it. I think by composting it, you will lose carbon dioxide in that composting process, but you'll also then have a product which is eminently available to the crop and probably more importantly to the soil microbiome. And certainly the work that was done at Rothamsted, where they compared, I think it was a barley crop over decades, where they'd applied fertilizer alongside farmyard manure and fertilizer but no farmyard manure, they always saw a benefit from applying farmyard manure, even when the actual NP and K content were the same. So I don't know if that answers the question, because I know that if you're somebody that is into composting, it really, and it becomes, it's quite critical almost what you're producing. Then you've also got the potential for is it the Sue Johnson process, which effectively is making compost tea from that compost, which potentially can further expand and increase the amount of microbes or bacteria, whatever, in that tea. But I would always come back to this thing, though, that, and we did do, when I was at the Soil Association, a field lab looking at the impact of compost teas. And obviously, when you make a compost tea, what you're seeking to do is to apply a whole load of bugs to the soil, which is great. My concern always is if there's not enough for them to eat once they get applied onto the soil, chances are they'll turn around and eat each other, which is fine to a certain degree. So what I really mean by that, if there's not enough organic matter in the soil to feed the bugs, then it's not going to work as effectively as if there are. I don't know, Lydia, you probably know more about composting than I do, but that would be my 2 penny worth.
Well, I think it's a great answer, and yeah, an idea of the net effect, that was a really difficult question to answer. It's a piece of string type of question, isn't it? Because it depends what the food is and its energy content and where it would have gone instead. But I think broadly speaking, putting waste food or surplus food, which I guess are slightly different things, into a compost type system or AD or whatever, rather than putting it into landfill, is certainly a good starting point. And of course, the AD digestate can be used and is very similar to a farmyard manure. After all, you could describe an AD as a metal cow, as some people have done. Yeah. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I'm just going to add, Lydia, that I think what we're getting better at is a bit like that emissions modelling that I showed you for changing farming practice. I don't think sort of 5 years ago that would have been anything like as accurate as it is now. And I think increasingly what we are able to do is do that calculation almost for the best use of things. It may not necessarily follow its best value, but I think increasingly where we can identify best use of different products, I think that would be quite helpful for people trying to decide where to put these products.
Absolutely. So yes, we've only got a couple of minutes left on our scheduled time. So thank you, Liz, for an absolutely brilliant talk and discussion. I've been working with Liz for years, but I never fail to learn something when talking to her or listening to one of her presentations. There are a number of events that will come up that are funded out of our project. Thanks again, DEFRA, for support on that. You can find out about them on the carboncapturecropping.com web pages. There are both live events and webinars coming up, and I'm going to hand over to Jasmine in just a second to tell you what's the next one that's coming up. But yes, please do go on our website and sign up to hear about those. But thanks everyone for joining us, and Jasmine, back to you to finish off.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, Liz. So the next webinar we have coming up will be on the 11th of December, and that one will be covering diverse swards, how you can stitch in species to create your herbal lays and create mixes with rooting synergies, and that will be with Ian Wilkinson and the team at Farm and Cotswold Seeds. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Hope to see you again sometime soon.